Second World War, and tens of thousands of young Africans were drafted overseas. The conflict was never really theirs, but for the first time they saw the conditions of their subjugated countries from the outside. They played their part in the winning of great victories, not least in Burma. In 1941, Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Franklin Roosevelt issued the famous Atlantic Charter. Their grand promise that after the war, we shall respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live. Africa's returning soldiers heard this pledge, and it raised high hopes.
The promises they had before the war, that after the war, some of them will be given better jobs and better pay, good money and so on, all the rest of it, and they had nothing.
The aura of superiority which had been there all along was destroyed by that war, at least for those soldiers who fought side by side with whites. Thereafter, on their return home, nobody could expect them to regard a white man as some little god. He was human, he had his weaknesses, he had his fears, and so on.
When peace came in 1945, nothing in the colonial landscape seemed different from before. Yet beneath the apparent calm, strong political pressures were building up. Even in remote rural areas, the message for a different future began to be heard. As well as the returning soldiers and their newfound aspirations, the seething expansion of many colonial towns, often 2 or 3 times bigger than before the war, also gave Africa's political leaders a mass audience for the first time. The struggle for independence moved firmly into the streets. Even the slow growth of primary education, wherever that occurred in some British, French and Belgian colonies, began to have a liberating influence. And that influence was carried further by young Africans now studying overseas.
Ils sont, virgule, tout, virgule, étonnés.
Up and down the country, you meet them everywhere. Men and women from the British colonies, working with us, learning from us. Nowadays, they and we share a common citizenship. But today we also share with them a common purpose, a partnership in progress and prosperity for us both. To us in the factory at home, this plan for mutual exchange may seem remote. But we are, every one of us, a part of it. For if the colonies are to send us the food and raw materials we're short of, we must send them the tools to do the job. We shan't complete so great a task overnight, but from every piece of equipment we can send to the colonies now, we stand to share the benefit ourselves in the future.
Looking back, one may well marvel at the complacency of the men who ruled the colonies from the tranquil corridors of Westminster and Whitehall. They saw no need to allow for any major political change, except in Britain's 4 West African colonies. And even there, the rulers wanted to move very slowly. Indeed, these worthy men deceived themselves, and their awakening to reality came from where it was least expected, from the Gold Coast, always considered to be Britain's model colony. A dramatic day of 1948 here in the capital Accra shattered that official complacency. Gold Coast troops had fought hard battles in Burma. They'd been part of what was called the Forgotten Army. Home again, the survivors once more felt themselves forgotten. They decided to march to the castle and present their grievances to the governor. With the castle already in sight, they arrived at this point along the road to its approach, and here they ran into a cordon of police armed with rifles barring the way. This angered the ex-servicemen. They'd come in peace. Now there were protests, shouts. Tear gas was thrown by the police and stones were thrown back. The march had begun to fray into a fight. at which point the European officer in charge of the police lost his head. He snatched a rifle from one of his men and opened fire with it into the marching veterans, killing or wounding several of them.
I saw exactly what happened. They were stopped, and then the soldiers started shooting. Why should they stop them? Then they started throwing tear gas to disperse them. And through the tear gas, all of them, they scattered all over the place, and they took stones. They started throwing stones. And through the tear gas, the enemy gave a command, and they started to shoot. I was right behind them, just like that. They started to shoot.
Lance Corporal Atipo, he was shot, dead. Another colleague of mine, a classmate of mine at Kofodia, he was shot at the hip. I gathered him with a couple of my friends and put him on the wayside. But it looked awkward. One will fight in Burma for 3 good years, returning home and then come to die at the crossroad. I mean, the whole thing took it by surprise.
Then one soldier fell, another fell, and the third one. The fourth one, it's a schoolboy who was standing right between the two of us, myself and a friend of mine, behind. A bullet came through him and the boy fell. I held him up and found that the bullet passed through his thighs and came out from his buttocks. He fell, died later.
In itself, this was a rather small colonial killing, and yet it was to have a tremendous significance, for it exploded into rioting and looting here at Accra and rapidly in other towns. And those riots were the prelude to a strong political demand for independence. And that demand for independence now found its spokesman, a young nationalist with a vision of a free and progressive Africa. His name was Kwame Nkrumah. He formed a party for immediate action, and thousands rallied. His right-hand man was Komlo Bedema.
We got more following because we were more youthful, more active, and more forceful in our speeches. As a result, the youth, of course, it's more especially because of Nkrumah's personality, they flocked to our side.
Because you pushed harder?
We pushed harder and asked for more things than the elders would do. We wanted self-government now. When the Kuse Constitution came out, they said some form of self-government should be given to the people. We said we wanted full self-government now.
Big news from the Gold Coast, where the people recently went to the polls under the new constitution. The paramount chief of Accra was there with his retinue to record his vote, and everywhere in the capital, the people gathered to play their part in the democratic process, the free election of members of the Legislative Assembly.
Although Nkrumah himself had been thrown into prison for political reasons by the British, polling was peaceful. African voters proved to a skeptical colonial government that they could use the ballot box as well as anyone else. 2 main parties contested the election, and the result was an overwhelming victory for Nkrumah and his movement. Bowing to this result, Britain changed its policy and offered power, but purely over internal affairs, to an African government.